Good morning. Is it morning? No, it's afternoon. So my name is Fred Birnbaum, founder of Freedom Foundation. Among other things, I spend a lot of time reviewing the budget. And I always remind myself that it's very easy to make these discussions both confusing and boring for the average person because there is a fair amount of complexity in the budget. I think everyone has heard about all the federal money that's come to every state, including Idaho. I'm going to start on that briefly. The reason I'm not going to spend too much time is you can really go down a rabbit hole because there's so many different funding sources. It can get kind of confusing. So just here's the big picture. The state legislature appropriates money. That is their primary constitutional function. Obviously, they do other things. They pass other laws, but they have to leave with a balanced budget. And in most years before COVID, we had three distinct buckets: general fund money, and that's money raised from sales taxes, personal income taxes, corporate taxes, some other product taxes. That's the general fund bucket. There's a dedicated fund, would be examples like fish and game license fees. Fish and game license fees only get spent by Fish and Game. They don't go to fixed roads. Kind of makes sense, dedicated. And then there's federal money, and that's always run in the range of 30% or so of what the state spends, a few $1 billion, the federal money. And where does that go? A lot of it is for Medicaid. Medicaid is just ballooning in costs. Of course, some of it goes to education, and then it can go to roads, of course. So just to put a bow on this and to move into these documents, before COVID, the state appropriated, the legislature, about $9 billion of all those buckets, federal, dedicated, money for state. The federal government during this period of COVID has injected into Idaho 18 billion, 18.6. It hasn't all been spent, doesn't all go through the state, but just think of this: if you earned $90,000 a year and somebody showed up with $180,000 on top of the $90,000, you'd be like, wow, a new truck, maybe I'll remodel my house. Maybe I'll even sell my house. Maybe I'll go on vacation. It obviously would change how you view money. And I think that's one of the dangers, is because this federal money, this $18 billion, everyone knows it isn't free. But the challenge is, how do you treat it like it's not free when it shows up? And it's printed and borrowed money. Because when this money was sent to us by the feds, they already had a deficit, right? So if you're in a deficit and you spend more, so if anyone tells you you're just getting your taxpayers' dollars back, no, you're not. Nobody's paying for this, or your grandkids will, and will pay in many ways, like inflation. So we could go down a rabbit hole, someone's raising their hand, talk about all those funds, streams, and that's a lot. But I want to talk about some practical stuff. You have a quick question? Okay, sure. I'm sorry. So as Idahoans, we pay taxes. You pay sales tax, you pay income tax. The federal government obviously gets taxpayers' money. But when you run a deficit, meaning you're spending more than your revenues, that isn't covered by taxpayers. That's what I'm referring to. So in other words, everything the federal government sent us related to COVID was on top of borrowed money. So it's obviously not covered by your taxes, right? Does that make sense? One last question. I need to keep moving here, and then I'm going to...
Briefly, in 2 sentences, describe what are the strings attached to the money you got.
No, but I'm going to give you one example. So my answer is yes. It's actually a great question. But I'm going to give one example, then we're going to move on. So you all heard about the Biden vaccine mandate, and the Supreme Court said that you cannot compel businesses with over 100 employees using OSHA rules to get a vaccine. They threw that out 6-3. But what they didn't throw out, here's a federal string, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid, it's called CMS. And CMS provides money to Idaho and the other states for Medicaid and Medicare. They said if you're a recipient, meaning St. Luke's, St. Al's, Big Medicine, of this money, your employees must get vaccinated or you don't get the money. That is not just a string, that's a noose. Let me say that again. Our hospital system here gets about half of its revenues, not my numbers, their numbers, from Medicare and Medicaid payments, the bulk of which are federal. Medicare is all federal, Medicaid is shared state federal. Half of the money that runs our hospitals comes from the feds. The feds have said the employees of these healthcare providers must vaccinate. If they don't, we can cut off the money. That's like I said, that's not a string, that's a noose. So there's one example. So, and then there are a lot of others. So let's look at what I've handed out. Everybody's heard that we have a $1.9 billion surplus. Well, what does that mean? Well, I guess using your checkbook as an example. So whatever you have, let's say you had in your checkbook normally $200. I know that's not the right number, but we're going to use that. And now all of a sudden you have $1,900. And you could add zeros. Maybe you could make it 2,000 and 19,000. It doesn't matter. So how did we get the surplus? Well, some of it obviously is we're growing as a state. Some of it is the flow through of all this federal money, right? Because if you give people money and they go buy something, they pay sales tax. Or if you're a business and you got this grant, a lot of it does end up, not all of it, but it ends up in revenue accounts, right? Because you spend it. I guess if you just sat on it, then it wouldn't. So what happens is when the government gets more revenues than it's spending, it runs a surplus, and the governor brags about that. But one of the reasons we have this surplus is because the federal government borrowed money, sent it our way. Wow, we are so great. We have this big surplus. But a lot of it is driven by the COVID money. And the reason I say that is it's very obvious when you look at revenue growth in Idaho, it was like this, it's going up, and then it shot up in 1 year. So you just can't say, well, it's people moving in. They've been moving in here for a decade. So what this chart basically shows is the governor calls the surplus $1.9 billion. And when you run it all through all the spending, you have this ending balance like in your checkbook, and that's that number at the bottom at the end of fiscal 23. So that will be this 214 would be June 30th, 2023. We'll have $214 million in the checkbook. But if we didn't do all of this stuff, we'd have about $2.7 billion. So a little more than the governor is saying. Where is all that going? I want to talk about that and how we can create more tax cuts. Now, while we're here, just minutes ago, they passed a $600 million tax cut, income tax. We like it, maybe we love it. We thought they should prioritize property tax relief, but it's tax relief. So that very first pink bar is part of where it went. You say, well, that's not $600 million, that's $413. Well, they pulled in money from a tax relief fund, so this is the net. So that's where some of that money went. And I'm going to just hit some of these bigger ones. There's some other tax policy. There's a budget stabilization fund and a public school stabilization fund where they store money. Well, they're going to put between the two of them another $240 million in there. In the general funds, which is state money, they are bringing some federal money. That's the ARPA offset. Don't really need to talk too much about that. I have to make all these numbers. If you added them all up with the ones to the right minuses and the ones to the left pluses, you go from the 266 at the top and the small print to 214. So these are all the things the governor says are essential. Fire suppression, 5 years of funding, $150 million. I would think that's too much. I mean, 2 years is a lot. $78 million for the water fund, another $25 million for an insurance pool. The big ones, transportation and the building fund, that's over $1 billion. Now, don't we need that? The question is, of course, we need some of it, but do we need all of it? I'm going to say something that might not sound nice, but part of the building fund is a new women's prison. We send female prisoners out of state when we have too many, but do we really want to build another facility? I mean, that should be debated. And the reason I say that is out-of-state placement's a variable cost. If you build the prison, it's a fixed cost. So, and I'll hold off for questions just for a minute and hold your question. So within these numbers, there's opportunities, we believe, to spend less, not to spend zero. And that's what the second page is about. The governor wants to get rid of $176 million. He wants to retire of debt. Fine. Don't have a problem with that. Public school supplementals. He wants you to basically put money forward to put all teachers on the state insurance plan. Now, teachers are getting a $1,000 bonus. They've accelerated the career ladder. Maybe this is excessive to then give them another benefit, but that's there, and that's $75 million. And then there are a whole bunch of other things and supplementals. This is more money for agencies than the agencies asked for in this case. Higher wages and benefits, probably a roughly 5% raise. It's broken up in a couple pieces. So a lot of money. And what's the bottom line, which is the second page? In a short evening, I went through all of this and I said, well, I'm not going to zero it out. I'm going to give the governor all that deferred maintenance on roads and bridges. But do we really need all the money in those stabilization funds? Do we really need all the money in the fire? Do we really need that health insurance buy-in? Do we really need to spend money to put every veteran who's in a veteran's home in their own private room? Do we really need the prison? Do we really need all the pay raise? Do we really need all that discretionary health insurance money? As you can see, I didn't zero a lot of these out. Oh, the one I did, so we're spending $3 billion plus on education. Well, let's spend another $47 million on literacy. Well, wait a minute. I thought literacy is what the $3 billion is supposed to accomplish. This is just a way to create all-day kindergarten. And it goes on and on and on. We spend about $10 million a year providing hepatitis C treatment for prisoners. Guys, they shot up, they're in prison, they have hepatitis C. That's a lot of money. I mean, I don't know if that's really our responsibility. Did someone destroy their health? But that's how it is now. We have to pay for that. I'm just saying cut it in half. And then the colleges get over $600 million, but they want another $10 million for discretionary. And I just scratched the surface on Medicaid. So what did just in doing these, again, we're not cutting spending. I cut the growth of spending. I found another $700 million after the tax cut that passed 15 minutes ago. And so all this notion that we're starving government, we can't afford more tax, it's just complete nonsense. The governor and the state is awash in money. Some of the money should be spent on fixing roads and bridges and infrastructure. Those things make sense, right? You don't want a bridge to fall down. But they use that sort of as a cloaking device, to use the Star Trek term, Romulan cloaking device. They use it as a smokescreen to then shove all this other money through state agencies, adding hundreds of employees, and then saying, well, we gave you this one tax cut. There's no money for other tax relief. And we believe absolutely take the grocery tax, food off groceries, because now food's up, so when you pay your 6%, you're paying it on inflated numbers. Take the tax off food, costs about $255 million, maybe spend another $200 to $400 million property tax relief, and you have the income tax cut that just passed. So that's really what I wanted to convey. There's more money than they know what to do with. Unfortunately, they're going to do things like grow government. When I say they, these are the governor's, just to be clear, these are the governor's proposals that he outlined. This is the governor's budget. The legislature doesn't have to agree, doesn't mean any of us have to agree. As Tip O'Neill once says, the president proposes, Congress disposes. The governor proposes, the legislature disposes. Unfortunately, there is a power imbalance. And because the legislature, shows up here in January, and the governor has sort of greased the skids on a lot of this. And we've already seen that. That's why the tax cut is being voted on so soon. So the governor has already, worked the field, so to speak, and said, we have to do all these things. And so he's made a very aggressive pitch to do everything that I'm talking about, because I used his budget from that book, 700 pages. I didn't make any of these numbers up. And all we're saying is if you're really a fiscal moderate, or even certainly a conservative, even a moderate, you wouldn't spend all this. You'd give money back to Idahoans. They have more in their pockets to combat inflationary pressures that they feel every day and unfortunately are not going away. So I want to save time for questions, so please ask any and all questions. Wow, I don't know who, we're going to go like this. Well, you had a few, so I'm going to start with this side and work around.
I just have a quick question. People are asking online if there's a way they can access these two papers
We'll post them.
on your website.
Yeah, we'll post them. Yeah, and of course, feel free to take extras.
So I heard that last election, Ada County got some out-of-state money to help administer the election.
Terrific question. So I'll repeat questions so people know. So, it does not. So remember, we're in the Capitol, and the Capitol is the home of the legislature, which appropriates state money. Now, the state does send money to local units of government, counties, through revenue sharing distributions, meaning counties and cities. But the counties have their own sources of money, right? You write that check out in your property tax. It doesn't go to the state, it goes to the county. And the county does administer Ada County elections. Well, Mark Zuckerberg came up with a brilliant idea that he would give millions of dollars to help drive the vote. They set up a nonprofit, hundreds of millions, and that would get out the vote. Well, he put money in areas that would drive out the vote or get out the vote. So it was a voter education project put on by Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, in which Ada County participated to encourage voter turnout in democratically dominant areas. It wasn't exclusively, because that would have been too obvious. Now, that could be stopped. In other words, you could say that private people should not influence, and I agree, but it's kind of out of the scope of this, but that will be addressed, I think, by some people in the legislature. So that was totally outside of this appropriation and outside of this funding. Yes?
So we've got $623 million.
Yes.
Is there a
So that's a great question on the permanent building fund. The permanent building fund is actually a zero budget. So basically what they do is they identify projects, they spend the money, and then it sort of zeroes out, and doesn't necessarily mean that all the bills are paid. And so they're actually, it's an accumulation of specific projects. So for example, I don't remember the exact number, but let's say actually it is on here, the women's facility is $112 million. That $112 million is a subset of the $623 million. The second page where you see women's facility, and it says OT, I should have explained that. That's one time, and OG is ongoing. And I think when we put it online, I'll explain that. But that's a subset. So what I did is I took all these bars and I found from those buckets. So what that is, that 623 is for these 2 fiscal years. This is all the projects they're going to do related to building and construction. So it would not be road maintenance, which of course would appear in Idaho Transportation Department. And that 453 would be maintenance, deferred maintenance would be roads, bridges, things like that. So the danger, you bring it up, is that some of the projects are ones that go to, either favored constituencies or things that, help certain officials. In other words, it wouldn't necessarily be our priorities, but I wouldn't call it a slush fund. They're projects. There is another danger. Is there anyone here who is in commercial construction or anything like that? Raise your hand, or any of those sorts of things. Well, here's the problem. When the government spends this much money, it's outbidding, right? I mean, they're out there and they want to get these things done. So they're driving up input costs, materials. We all see that if you build anything or buy anything, and that could be anything from things used for paving or wood or anything. So when you throw out $1 billion and everyone knows you've got to spend it because you're on a timeline, drives up prices. And of course, if you're a private construction person competing with the state, that doesn't end very well for you. And it certainly doesn't if you're even a homeowner or you want a commercial building. So, good question.
You can track money that's coming in from the feds for various things like this infrastructure.
Right.
We're talking about infrastructure.
Right. So Lieutenant Governor McGee, and actually when we were sitting there, she brought that up. The answer is it is being tracked. The spreadsheets would give everyone a headache, and of course they're constantly being updated. And unfortunately, I think the way it's part of it's the strings, and there's just so much documentation. I think that what we'll see is when the dust settles, if it ever does, We'll see what went where. But right now in this ongoing process, you have this sort of lag between what's appropriated and what's spent. And the visibility is not great. It's not because there's necessarily anyone hiding it. It's just an unprecedented amount of money. Again, the state normally appropriates $9 billion. Now, not all this came into the state treasury, but $18 billion came into the state. A subset of that, a few billion, went directly to be spent by the state. And the guidance has changed between Trump and Biden. And they ask the questions, well, can we do this? Can we do that? So it's this evolving process. So a lot of it is going to be used, or some of it certainly, for things that we need. But the problem is there's such an excess, it's going to drive bad habits. So the state is proposing to add several hundred new employees there, in health and welfare, and they're just going to grow government. And then when the spigot gets turned off, they'll turn to you and me to keep those things alive.
And is there any way for us to find out what screens are attached to this money?
Yeah, so the answer is yes, and there's some extensive documentation. Again, the biggest string I'm going to give is the noose of the Medicare and Medicaid money. I mean, when you tell our hospitals that you have to, and I have time for one more question, that you have to require vaccination in order to administer Medicaid or Medicare, that's more than a string. All right, 2 more questions. You'll get one, but she goes first. How much did you say? I don't think it's that much, but yes, there's an affordable housing, there is an appropriation for that. I don't have the details on that. It's on I think it is in his overall proposal, and afterwards I can look. And maybe I'm not sure if that's tied to ARPA or not. I kind of focused on the things here that were noted as general fund expenditures, but this is not a completely comprehensive list. So that's a great question. Yes.
So when government agencies are given more money than they ask for, they invariably end up hiring new employees. And so what is promised as a one-time expenditure ends up being an ongoing thing. It might be interesting to track the growth of employees coming from Governor Little's proposals. My second point is...
So let me just speak to that. You can actually see that. So he's trying to add more than 400 new full-time positions. That's his request. It's in the budget book. I can show you after. So that's not a hypothetical, that's an actual. So there's going to be 400 new positions in state government.
So the other thing is you didn't mention debt service. We have $1.9 billion to spend. We end up with $200 million plus at the end. $176 billion of debt service. What is that debt, and why are we retiring it with our wash of money?
So this is the debt that's callable that can be retired. So we could spend a lot of time talking about debt that's callable, but if you buy a bond, you might not want it retired, right? I mean, you want to hold on to it. So certain bonds are callable. I mean, the seller can pay you off as the buyer. So I think this, and I'm not positive, but I believe this sort of was as far as they could push it. Idaho's balance sheet is pretty good, but here's the danger, and I'll close on this because I think we're out of time. In 2021, actual spending, of course, everyone looks at the appropriation, but when the book's closed, 46% of the state appropriation in fiscal 21, and that's before most of this washes through, was federal money. And so that's really the danger. If you just went back a few years, it was in the mid-30s. So now we're talking about the strings, we're completely dependent for half of our appropriation on the federal government, which of course is $29 trillion and growing in debt. So as much as we want to crow about it and the governor wants to crow about it, he's sort of absorbing all these funds with the view that, well, I'm going to just spend most of it on one time. But it's sort of like someone cheating on their diet. Oh, I'm just going to eat half the cheesecake. It just it's cumulative. And so, yes, that is a very big fear, especially when you add headcount, because it's nearly impossible to fire government employees. And they'll do it. And of course, they don't want to be fired, and they'll push back if you try that. So that is something that conservatives should always be leery of, which is adding headcount. It's one thing if you're spending more money on roads and you scale that back, fine. But if you're actually going to an agency and say, well, you've got 1,800 people, next year you're only going to have 1,700, that's a fight. And so, yes, it's usually a one-way street when you start adding folks. I think I have to wrap up because our time is up. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Lieutenant Governor McGeehan and Michelle Hamilton for hosting this. I really appreciate the time. Idaho Freedom Foundation, idahofreedom.org. You can go on our website. We'll post this. You can ask me questions, and I'll do my best to answer anything related to anything, but especially budget stuff.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you.
So much.
Thanks.